Sometime in the winter of 1888, an ordinary wooden barn began to appear in the records as if it were an address, and at the same time, a silence. The Whitethorn County archives, now stored in acid-free cardboard boxes in the basement of the old courthouse, describe the Whitethorn family as any other. Farmers, Protestants, discreet, known for the almost rigid regularity with which they kept to the calendar of harvests and church services. No extraordinary notes, no warnings. Just names, dates, births, marriages, taxes paid on time. Until suddenly, there's a gap that no subsequent document has been able to fill. The property was just over 2 miles from the main road, in a low stretch of the valley where the wind always seemed to arrive late. The barn, built around 1870, was too large for the size of the family. This is stated in an agricultural report from the time, written in faded ink. Solid structure, disproportionate to the declared herd. At the time, no one questioned it. In that region, prevention was part of survival. The Whitethorns had lived there for 2 generations. The patriarch, Elias Whitethorn, was born in 1849. A man of few words with weathered hands, he was known for avoiding conflict and never visiting the city unless strictly necessary. His wife, Margaret, kept the house with quiet rigor. Their children, 8 in all, helped in the fields from an early age. All of this is repeated in testimonies collected years later, as if the collective memory insisted on reaffirming normality, perhaps to make it bearable. The community was small, 30-odd families scattered across miles of uneven land, connected more by habit than by physical proximity. At night, the darkness was not a phenomenon. It was a presence. Rare lanterns, dirt roads, the distant sound of animals, and sometimes religious songs that crossed the valley with no definite origin. It was in this environment that the first mentions of the so-called night prayers in the barn appeared. They do not appear in official records, but in private letters, incomplete diaries, and oral accounts collected decades later by a local teacher. According to these fragments, once a week, sometimes twice, lights were seen through the cracks in the wood after the main house had already been darkened. Low, rhythmic voices, long periods of silence between one sentence and another. Nothing that could be called illegal. Nothing that would justify a visit from the authorities. Still, something was off. A neighbor wrote in 1887, "It's not like Sunday worship. It's quieter, heavier, as if they were waiting for something." In the months leading up to the disappearance, indirect records indicate an unusual flow of people passing through the property. Distant cousins, families known from church, single men who worked in sawmills to the north, widowed women, names that appear only once in the guest books and never again. At the time, this did not alarm anyone. The valley was a place of slow passage. People came, stayed, left. The winter that year was particularly harsh. The roads were impassable for weeks. The mail failed. Visits ceased. It was during this interval that the Whitethorns disappeared from the daily records. No purchases in town, no deliveries, no animals sold or traded. The field remained untouched, as if work had been interrupted mid-gesture. When their absence was finally noticed, it was too late to reconstruct the early days. What remained were incomplete documents, contradictory statements, and one recurring detail, noted in the margins of 3 separate files, by different hands, in different years. The barn was locked from the inside. This small, almost trivial detail is where the records stop explaining, and the silence begins. Before becoming a blind spot on maps and in files, the Whitethorn property followed a predictable, almost ritualistic rhythm, common to rural families in the late 19th century. The days began before dawn. The sound of boots on the floor, the creaking of the door, the steam of breath in the cold of dawn. The surviving accounts describe a harsh but organized routine, sustained more by repetition than by any ambition. Elias Whitethorn always woke up first. There is a note in an account book, preserved by chance, that records times with almost obsessive precision. 4:30 in the morning, 5 in the warmer months. Margaret appeared shortly after, lighting the wood stove while the older children went to the barn to tend to the animals. There are no mentions of domestic conflicts, fights, or serious disagreements. On the contrary, neighbors remembered a reserved but cohesive family, united by silence, as a Methodist pastor wrote in a letter sent years later to a colleague. The barn always occupied a central place in this routine, not only as a workspace, but as a meeting place. During the day, it was there that corn was separated, tools were repaired, and animals were sheltered from sudden storms. At night, however, its use seemed to change. It is in this detail that the reports begin to lose their clarity and take on an uncomfortable tone. According to testimonies collected between 1910 and 1920, the so-called night prayers were not announced. There were no formal invitations. People simply showed up, always after sunset, always in small groups. They arrived on foot or in silent carts, left their animals tied up at a distance, and entered the barn without prolonged greetings. They would stay for hours. A woman, identified only as Mrs. Caldwell, reported in a late testimony that she had attended one of these meetings in late 1887. She said there was no sermon, no exalted preaching, just long readings, extended pauses, and moments when no one spoke, as if waiting for some internal confirmation. It wasn't fear, she wrote, it was heaviness. Other testimonies mention subtle changes in the Whitethorns' behavior during that period. Ilias began to avoid the town altogether. Margaret reduced her visits to church. The children, previously seen playing in the fields, became more reclusive. A merchant noted that, in their last recorded purchases, the family acquired more lanterns than usual and large quantities of oil, incompatible with normal domestic use. None of this, taken in isolation, indicated danger. The context of the time favored practical explanations. Harsh winters, growing religious fervor, the search for comfort in times of economic uncertainty. Still, when the reports are superimposed, a persistent sense of displacement emerges, as if something were being prepared, without anyone knowing exactly what. There is also the question of visitors. Among the names identified in letters and diaries, at least 33 appear associated with the Whitethorn property between 1886 and the beginning of 1888. Some were distant relatives. Others are known only by nicknames or vague descriptions: the man from the sawmill, the widow from the valley, two brothers from the north. None of them are mentioned again in later records from the region. Curiously, there are no reports of tension between these visitors and the family. On the contrary, memories speak of restrained hospitality, simple meals shared in silence, long walks to the barn at nightfall. A young man from the neighborhood, who is said to have observed one of these arrivals from a distance, wrote years later that it did not seem like a reunion, but a slow farewell. Winter was approaching when the last visits were recorded. The roads began to close. The valley plunged into isolation. Daily life continued for some time. This is confirmed by recent marks on the ground and the condition of the animals when the property was finally visited. Then, without warning, everything ceased. The field remained unharvested. The house remained closed. The barn, always present, became the only place where something still seemed to resist time. According to the first man who approached the site weeks later, there were recent footprints around the building, but no trail leading off the property. This detail, footsteps that went out but did not return, appears repeatedly in 3 different statements, and it is from this point on that the records cease to talk about routine and begin to revolve around a single night. The reconstruction of the night of the Whitethorns' disappearance is not based on a single document, but on fragments that, when aligned, form a disturbingly coherent sequence. There is no exact time recorded. There are no direct witnesses to the final moment. What exists are indirect traces, sounds heard in the distance, lights perceived for a few moments, marks on the ground, and above all, the sudden absence of any activity after that night. According to the county's weather records, the night was cold but stable. The sky was clear. There was no storm, no strong wind, no natural event that could explain such an abrupt displacement of so many people. This is important. because it eliminates one of the most common explanations used in the early months of the investigation, the hypothesis of a silent natural disaster. The last reliable report comes from a farmer named Thomas Reed, whose property was just over a kilometer to the south. In a statement taken years later, he claimed to have seen light in the Whitethorn barn late at night, something unusual even by recent standards. He said that, out of curiosity, he counted at least 5 lanterns lit simultaneously. It seemed brighter than normal, he wrote, but there was no noise. Other reports mentioned footsteps, many footsteps, no running, no confusion, just the rhythmic sound of people walking across the ground hardened by the cold. A silence broken only by the occasional creaking of the barn wood and the distant crackling of the fire kept inside. No screams, no arguments, nothing that could be heard as an emergency. It is likely that on that night not only the Whitethorn family was gathered, but also visitors who had registered in previous months. The names add up to 33 people, a number that appears repeatedly in incomplete lists and marginal notes, always with question marks next to them. It is not known if everyone was present at the same time, but the evidence suggests that they were. The internal layout of the barn was never officially documented, but later reports indicate that the space had been reorganized. Makeshift benches, a central circle left free, lanterns suspended at different heights, creating zones of light and shadow. A former visitor, who claimed to have attended previous meetings but not that night, described the feeling of being inside something that did not allow for haste. What happened after the doors were closed was not recorded. There are no signs of a struggle inside, no marks of violence, no tools out of place. When the barn was opened weeks later, everything seemed strangely intact. The fire had gone out on its own. The lanterns were empty. The doors, locked from the inside, required force to open. Outside, however, the scene was different. Footprints were concentrated around the barn but did not lead away from it. There were no trails leading to the woods, no clear direction towards the valley. It was as if everyone had arrived and stopped there. The animals on the property survived for some time on their own. This indicates that no one returned to the house after that night. The kitchen table, according to a late report, was partially set. A plate with dry leftovers, an overturned glass. Small details that suggest interruption, not planned abandonment. Local authorities were slow to react. The isolation of winter delayed any organized action. When an improvised team was finally formed, there were no longer any clear footprints. Only the heavy silence of a place where something had ended without explanation. The most disturbing detail, repeated in different versions of the report, is simple. There were no signs of a collective departure. No evidence that 33 people left the property together. No trace of transportation. No bodies. No scattered personal belongings. The last concrete evidence found that night was a partially burned record book left on a barrel near the center of the barn. The preserved pages contained only names written in the same handwriting with no dates, no comments. The list ended abruptly in the middle of a line. That book was never officially catalogued. It disappeared from the inventory months later, and it is from that point on, when the names exist but the people do not, that the case ceases to be just a disappearance and becomes a problem for everyone who tried to explain it. The reaction to the Whitethorns' disappearance was neither immediate nor coordinated. In that region and at that time, prolonged silence was not, in itself, an emergency. Winters isolated families. Illness kept neighbors away. Absence needed weeks, sometimes months, to become a concrete concern. When that happened, what was found no longer allowed for simple answers. The first to officially enter the property were 2 county representatives and a local pastor, summoned more by the insistence of the community than by formal order. The initial reports, written in cautious language, avoid any direct conclusions. They speak of unexplained absence, property abandoned with no signs of escape, and need for further observation. It is as if the writers themselves hesitated to record anything definitive. The news spread slowly, gaining different versions as it passed through villages and churches. Some said that the Whitethorns had left together in search of better lands. Others claimed that a silent disease had taken the family and visitors. None of these hypotheses stood up to even minimal analysis of the facts. There were no bodies. There were no trails. There were no records of mass displacement anywhere in the region. As the days passed, contradictory statements began to emerge. One man claimed to have seen Elias Whitethorn walking alone on the road weeks after the alleged disappearance, a version that was never confirmed. A woman swore she had heard singing coming from the valley the following spring, but could not indicate the exact direction. These reports were noted, filed away, and set aside. What most disturbed the authorities were not the rumors, but the small concrete clues. Inside the barn, under a thin layer of dust, personal items were found that made no sense to be there. A stopped pocket watch, an embroidered handkerchief with initials that did not belong to any family member, a pair of boots of a size incompatible with any known residents. Evidence that visitors had indeed been present, and that they had not left with everything they had brought. The most disturbing revelation, however, came months later, almost by accident. While reviewing old church records, a clerk noticed that several of the names found in the burned notebook in the barn matched people who had been reported missing in other parts of the valley in previous years. Isolated cases, never connected to each other. Workers who did not return. Widows who went to live with relatives. Young people who simply ceased to exist in the records. This finding was not announced publicly. It was restricted to marginal notes, private correspondence, and a brief attempt to reopen old investigations, an effort that did not progress. There were no resources, there was no evidence, and above all, there were no survivors to confirm any connection. Over time, the property was abandoned for good. The barn remained standing for decades, avoided by most, not out of overt fear, but out of discomfort, a place where nothing visible had happened, and yet everything seemed to have ended. No formal charges were ever filed. No one was ever held responsible. The Whitethorn case went into the archives as an unsolved mass disappearance, accompanied by a short, recurring comment in subsequent reports. Total lack of plausible conclusion. And it is precisely this absence of explicit violence, of obvious conflict, of clear explanation, that makes the case so difficult to close, because everything points not to an abrupt event, but to a progressive shared decision, and one that was never fully recorded. Decades later, when rereading these documents, what is most striking is not what is written, but what was avoided writing, as if everyone on some level understood that certain human choices leave insufficient traces to be judged. And it is with this feeling of something understood too late that the case moves toward its final record. When the Whitethorn case is revisited decades later, there are no longer any living witnesses, no institutional interest, no expectation of a solution. What remains are fragile papers, faded ink, margins annotated by different hands, and the belated effort to understand something that was never allowed to be fully observed. The archives are now incomplete. Some of the material has disappeared over the course of the century, lost in administrative changes, minor fires, common carelessness. Still, enough survives for the silence of that valley to remain audible. There is something unique about the way the case was closed, not with an explanation, but with the exhaustion of searching for one. No bodies were found, no ditch, no evidence of collective violence, no trial, no acquittal. Just official confirmation that 33 people, an entire family and their visitors, ceased to exist in the records at the same time, in the same place, without a sound. The barn ended up collapsing in the early 20th century. The wood was reused. The land changed hands. Today, anyone passing by the site sees nothing but uneven pasture and a slight depression in the ground, almost imperceptible. There is no sign. There is no landmark. Nothing indicates that the story of dozens of lives ended there, and perhaps that is the most faithful to what really happened. Upon rereading the testimonies, the narrator-historian notices a discrete but persistent pattern. No one describes extreme fear. No one speaks of despair. The words that are repeated are others: wait, waiting, decision, silence. Human terms, imperfect, difficult to translate into legal or investigative language. The disappearance of the Whitethorns does not impose itself as a spectacular enigma, but as a dense absence. A case in which the mystery does not arise from the unexpected, but from normality, taken to a point of no return. There is no identified villain. There is no single event to point to, just a sequence of small choices accumulated over time until the outside world ceased to matter. Perhaps those people were not taken. Perhaps they left. Perhaps not all at the same time, nor in the same way, nor with the same certainty. History does not allow us to say. And the historian responsible for this reconstruction avoids filling in these gaps with comfortable assumptions. There is a handwritten comment found on the back of a report dated 1912. It is unsigned. It is not part of the official text. It simply says, "Some stories don't end, they just stop being observed." The Whitethorn case is one of those stories, and in the end, the silence that remained in the valley asks for no explanation, only respect.